Hello and welcome back to the Spoken Word. My name is Travis. I'm your host, and today we are continuing our discussion of the Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. So we did a lot of math and confusing stuff in part one, but now we're really going to try and drill down and identify who this Pharaoh was. So to review from part one, we have two possibilities about the unnamed Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. He is either A, the baby killing father of the Pharaoh's daughter that we meet in Exodus 2, which would be Thutmose the first if a young Hatshepsut is indeed Pharaoh's daughter. Option number two is an earlier Pharaoh ruling before Thutmose the first and after the arrival of Joseph in Egypt. The million-dollar question then is whether one Pharaoh enslaved the Israelites and killed the babies, or if these were two separate pharaohs. A single pharaoh could be in view in Exodus 1 and 2 because no explicit time gap is mentioned, like what we get in Exodus 2:11, where it says that years later, Moses visited his people. However, there could be a transitional summary passage in Exodus 1. Listen to the flow. A new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and powerful than we are. Come, let's deal shrewdly with them. Otherwise, they will multiply further, and when war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." Then the narrator comes in and gives a summary of what happened next. So the Egyptians assigned taskmasters over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor. They built Pithom and Ramesses as supply cities for Pharaoh. But the more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. They worked the Israelites ruthlessly and made their lives bitter with difficult labor in brick and mortar and in all kinds of field work. They ruthlessly imposed all this work on them. And the curtains close with that summary. Then the story picks up some unspoken amount of time later and talks about the midwives that defy the Pharaoh of their day and the subsequent order to throw the newborn baby boys into the river. So it does seem that time passes between verses 14 and 15, where we have the end of that summary statement and the beginning of the story about the midwives, because it talks about building store cities and the multiplication of the Israelites during their bondage. So all of these things take time. So perhaps time did pass between the summary ending in verse 14 and the story about the midwives starting in verse 15. That's not necessarily the case. It is still conceivable that one Pharaoh enslaved the people out of fear and also tried to stop their reproduction by killing a bunch of their males. But it's also conceivable that one did the enslaving and one of his successors was the baby slayer. So if we say that the enslaving Pharaoh and the baby killing Pharaoh are one and the same person, that would likely make him the father of Hatshepsut, who we're saying is probably Pharaoh's daughter, which would make him Thutmose the first. He is a solid candidate, but since I said that there could be two pharaohs involved here, he's not the only candidate. So let's investigate that. We established back in part one that we cannot establish a specific year of enslavement from the biblical text alone. So if it was not Thutmose the first, you might think that we can't get any more specific. That's true to an extent, but fortunately we have both the Bible and archaeology. So let's go back to the text and see if we can find some more clues about the enslaving Pharaoh. We actually get a hint of the political climate during his reign. First, he notes that the ethnic Egyptians have become an ethnic minority. He says that the Israelites are more numerous than we are. That's really odd. Did the Israelites just have bigger families, or did something happen to Egypt between the time of Joseph and the time of this Pharaoh? This sounds like a weaker Egypt than that of Joseph's day, and that weakness bred fear. Second, this Pharaoh was worried that the Israelites would, quote, join our enemies if war broke out. So who were these enemies? And why might the Israelites be inclined to join them rather than work with the Egyptians who they've been buddies with this whole time, presumably? Third, we see that his solution to these problems is to deal shrewdly with them. The Hebrew means to act wisely. Here it's obviously a negative connotation, so a word like shrewd or crafty is the idea. When Stephen discusses this Pharaoh in Acts 7:19, he says that the Pharaoh dealt treacherously with his ancestors. And the word that he uses has a range of meaning, including to circumvent by artifice or fraud, to conquer by subtle devices, to outwit, overreach, to deal craftily with. So this Pharaoh does not go to war against the Israelites or something like that. The Israelites were seemingly non-combatants who were otherwise on good terms. We have a Pharaoh here who is seeing ghosts and believing that the peaceful and long-established Israelites are now a threat. So he has to play politics and conquer them by subtle devices. I think he had to run a propaganda war against them for everyone to go along with it. This should sound familiar to anyone with a knowledge of World War II. It sounds like the Nazi treatment of Jews or the American treatment of Americans of Asian ancestry. There is truly nothing new under the sun, unfortunately. Now, how does any of this help us identify our Pharaoh? Well, these circumstances would uniquely match the climate at the early 18th dynasty. I think it is early on in this dynasty that the enslavement happened. Let me explain what I mean. History lesson time. The 14th dynasty of Egypt fell to some Semitic people called the Hyksos around 1720 BC by the High Chronology. So that's about 270 years before the Exodus. They took over in the Nile Delta, which is northern or lower Egypt. Upper and lower Egypt, confusingly, refer to the direction of the Nile's flow, not north or south. So lower Egypt is north with the Delta, and upper Egypt is upriver to the south. I'll use north and south here because my brain has a really hard time keeping upper and lower and north and south all straight. So you have the 14th dynasty that falls, and the Hyksos come to power around the Nile Delta. And that, by the way, is where Goshen is, where the Israelites lived. It was on the eastern side of the Delta. These Hyksos kings are called the 15th dynasty. So what happened to the native Egyptians? The native Egyptian dynasty retreated south and established their capital in Thebes. They made the 16th and 17th dynasties and were called the Theban dynasties since they ruled their southern kingdom in exile from Thebes. So to reiterate, the 14th dynasty is ruling in northern Egypt, including Goshen. The Hyksos come to power in northern Egypt at the fall of the 14th dynasty, about 270 years before the Exodus, and they make an insurgent 15th dynasty. The native Egyptian kings have to retreat south to Thebes, and they rule southern Egypt as the 16th and 17th dynasties. So the 16th and 17th dynasties are ethnic Egyptians who are ruling at the same time as the Semitic kings from the 15th dynasty. So I want you to ignore the numbers here and just think that the line of succession for the Egyptians goes 14th dynasty, skips the 15th, since those guys are the Hyksos, then it goes 16th, 17th. The 15th dynasty is a rogue dynasty that ruled parallel with the 16th and 17th. Now, in 1580 BC, the Hyksos finally fell to Ahmose I, a guy from the southern kingdom in exile. In all, they ruled about 140 years, and the Israelites were probably living in Goshen, minding their own business the whole time. So Ahmose I rolls into the Hyksos capital of Avaris. He kicks them all out, and he's left with the Israelites a stone's throw away. The Hyksos were Semitic. The Israelites are also Semitic. So he's left with this problem. And here's the kicker. Ahmose I is the founder of the 18th dynasty, the dynasty of our Exodus Pharaoh. This guy is actually Amenhotep II's great-great-grandfather. His relationship to Thutmose I, who I proposed as our baby slayer, is less clear-cut. He's like be a nephew or something like that. But Thutmose I is just two pharaohs down from this guy. So this is all happening very close to where we think that Moses is being born. So we have very close to the time of Thutmose I and Hatshepsut and all that stuff. We have a recent campaign that removed the Semitic Hyksos from Egypt. And that would explain the fear of the Semitic Israelites joining the Hyksos if they returned. It took a Herculean effort by multiple pharaohs to fully remove the Hyksos, so you can see the reason for fear here. Ahmose the first, his successor, Amenhotep the first, or his successor, Thutmose the first, would all have had a reason to fear a Hyksos counterattack and the Israelites becoming enemies within their own borders. The picture of a return of a battered kingdom in exile would also help explain why the Egypt of this time sounds much weaker than the Egypt of Joseph's day. Remember, the Israelites apparently outnumbered them, and the Hyksos incursion would help explain why. Also, the 140 years of Hyksos occupation and therefore radio silence between the Israelites and the native royalty of Egypt would also explain why the enslaving Pharaoh did not know a thing about Joseph. So, who was the slaver Pharaoh who did not know Joseph? I think the political climate of the early 18th dynasty gives a good reason for all the anti-Semitic paranoia we see in Exodus 1. Personally, my money is on Ahmose the First or Thutmose the First. Why? Ahmose the First would have had the most reason to remove all threats to his power as quickly as possible after ousting the Hyksos once and for all. Thutmose the First, I suspect, because he was just unhinged if he was the guy chucking baby boys into the Nile. So I could totally see him getting paranoid as well. Of the two, I would choose Ahmose the First because this allows for time for the Israelites to multiply under oppression and participate in construction and all those kinds of things that seem to be taking place in Exodus 1 before the baby slaying episodes. So, in my opinion, the Pharaoh who did not know Joseph was Ahmose the First, great-great-grandfather to none other than Amenhotep II, our Exodus Pharaoh. And that leaves the baby killer as Thutmose the First, father of Hatshepsut, our possible daughter of Pharaoh. So, there you have it. I believe that these are the two pharaohs that we meet in the early pages of Exodus. As before, there is a link in the description to a handy PDF that summarizes this episode for you. But with that, thank you so much for listening. I really hope that you enjoyed this episode. I'll see you in the next episode, but until then, God bless.